It's week 5 and I'm in the beautiful Gatineau Hills. Hi everyone, welcome to the week 5 feedback video. Okay, so I'm in the beautiful Meech Valley area of the Gatineau Park, which is about like half an hour north of Ottawa on the Quebec side. So this is the area I'm originally from, actually a bit further north. Beautiful time of year, beautiful fall colors. Hopefully we'll see some on the walk this morning. And yeah, so I'm up here visiting for a week and a half for family around Thanksgiving and stuff. So wanted to give you guys the week 5 feedback from this beautiful area. Okay, so week 5 all about sampling. Arguably my favorite topic of the term. I love sampling, so I'll try not to ramble too much today about it. But there are some topics surrounding sampling that I'd really like to discuss a bit more with you guys today. Before we get to that, just a quick word on the mini lectures. For week 5 went very well. Lots of great mini lectures, maybe a little bit more technical material this term, especially those of you who addressed probability sampling. There's kind of some statistical knowledge involved there. Some of it's a bit abstract regarding central tendency theorem and probability and what random sampling is and what random sampling actually looks like in practice in social scientific research. But most of you handle it very well, so that's great. Obviously, as usual, you've got my feedback posted in Dropbox in replies in the Dropbox comments window for week 5. That's kind of added to the other feedback I've been giving so far this term, and I've updated your grades as usual in Learn accordingly. So the first thing I want to talk about, related to some stuff that came up during the mini lectures and the overall themes of this week of sampling, was the question of representativity. Right, it's a big word. I have to say it a few times this morning, so hopefully won't mess it up too badly. But yeah, the idea of representativity, right? So the basic definition of representativity, right, is, and I've got my notes here, right? It's an estimate or characteristic in your sample that matches what you would find in your population, right? So whatever you find in your sample on a given variable is representative of what you would find across your whole study population, right? So I think most of you have grasped that. That's a pretty introductory concept there when it comes to sampling. But the issue I have with it is that in the textbook, and often a lot when we introduce the idea of representativity, it's introduced as a binary, right? Either something is representative or not. A sample is either representative or it isn't. And I have issue with that because in real life, in real samples in the social sciences, I would consider it more of a spectrum, a continuum. Your sample can be more representative, and we consider those samples better quality when they are. They can be less representative. But a sample is usually never fully representative of a population. And it's also not like completely unrepresentative and worthless, right? And that was kind of what we saw in the small article this week, was that even small samples that technically we can't be sure of the representativity still have something to contribute. And so now that you're getting more advanced in research methods, I would like you guys to kind of think of representativity more as this kind of continuum or spectrum, where a sample, depending on which variables you look at, a sample can be very representative on certain variables, but less representative on others, right? You can have a sample that's very representative of gender. There's that kind of 50-50 split between men and women, with a smaller size proportion going to non-traditional gender identities or like non-binary, trans, etc. But it can still be very unrepresentative on other variables like age. Maybe it's all young people in your sample, right? And that's the case for bigger, kind of better samples anyways, right? So when who work a lot in survey methodology and with statistics, will discuss sampling, I'll take a whole few paragraphs to say like, okay, so we compared we compared the kind of characteristics of our sample on these various variables, and we're looking at how they compare to, say, census data or other population data that we have. And so, the sample seems more representative on these specific variables, maybe less representative on these other ones, or at least it's representative on the variables that we can capture, that we can compare to the population, but may not be representative for some other reasons, such as maybe there was a type of coverage bias in the survey that we weren't able to get to certain groups in the population. So almost all samples are like that, right? There is no perfect probability, perfectly representative sample. It is quite rare to have very good quality samples. And these kind of high, large probability samples are quite costly and resource intensive to go and collect. So that's why in most studies, it's usually smaller samples, usually more non-probability forms of sampling, such as, you touched on them this week in your mini lectures, convenience, quota, purpose-driven samples, as well as snowball or referral sampling. And so those are much more commonly used because they're easier to do, right? Basically, in other words, they cost less money. You just basically survey people or interview people that you have access to more easily. And the big probability samples in Canada often require kind of bigger agencies that have more time and resources to do them, right? So I've got grant money to run the International Social Survey Program in Canada. That's one of the projects I do. And that's a probability sample of about 2,000 Canadians. And it takes a lot of time and money to get that. StatsCan, Statistics Canada, is probably where you find the largest, best quality probability samples in the country, right? But even for them, it's not perfect, right? So for example, just looking at the notes here, for their big surveys that they run once a year, say like the General Social Survey, there's still issues with that sample. That sample is great. It's like 25,000 people each year, relatively good response rates, which I'll get back to in a sec. And so it's a very good quality sample, representative on many variables. However, that survey is not run in the Northern Territories, so that doesn't have coverage. It's only run in the provinces. It doesn't reach those without a phone or without internet access. More and more surveys now are done online, and so those who don't have internet access aren't usually covered, right? It doesn't often reach institutionalized populations, so obviously people in prisons or in mental health organizations, institutions, other types of institutionalized populations sometimes they do. If they have a cell phone, they might be able to be part of these surveys. But not usually. And so that's another group that's in the population, but doesn't end up usually in the samples, even good quality StatsCan samples. And so all of these are types of what we call coverage bias, right? So not covering the territories, not covering people without internet access, usually, not covering institutionalized populations, usually, are all types of coverage bias, which even the best samples in our country don't manage to cover, right? Also, mentioned response rates before. StatsCan has a pretty good response rates for its surveys by our standards these days. They get about 65% response rate. So about 65% of the people they manage to contact answer their surveys. That's pretty good. That's based on their name recognition of StatsCan. Some people think that answering their surveys is mandatory. It's not, but they have that in mind. It's just the census you're required to fill out, as well as, I believe, the labor force survey. You're technically, legally supposed to fill it out, but I don't think StatsCan really does anything if you don't. But because of that, some people feel that they have to answer StatsCan surveys, and others just want to answer it because they know that it's good quality data that helps the government hopefully inform government policy. And so we get pretty good response rates. 65% is pretty darn good these days. Because of survey fatigue, most other surveys have way lower response rates than that. Like, if I get 10% response rate for my International Social Survey Program, I'm super thrilled. Some might, like using a variety of techniques, might be able to push it a bit higher than that. But especially if you're running an online surveys these days, response rates are incredibly low because everyone wants to run a survey all the time. Lots of people get asked to take lots of surveys all the time. A lot of people don't answer them anymore, right? Because there's I'm sure you've been asked to take a survey recently for a consumer survey or something like that. Back in the day, I say like the day when there was kind of like a golden era of sampling was kind of when most households had a landline. But there hadn't really been this kind of over fatigue of survey taking yet. So I'm thinking kind of 60s, 70s, 80s, maybe even in the 90s, when you could reach most households. There was like a list of most households in the telephone book, and you could sample from that, and you could reach most households and speak to someone at the household via the landline telephone. Those days we saw much higher response rates. That's when you got the response rates of 80, 90%. answering a survey was new and novel and people were interested, and so they often did answer the survey over the phone. Those days are gone and we're not coming back. And so so now the reality is that 65% response rate from StatsCan is actually pretty good. So all of these things to keep in mind, that there is no perfect probability, perfect random sample out there. However, that's not to say that you should throw the probability random thing completely out the window. There are definitely better quality samples that are more representative, and you should do as much as you can, given the time and resources you have, to make your sample as representative as you can. Even if it's a smaller sample, say 40, 60 people you're going to go and interview, you should still think about, like, okay, make sure that I have an even balance of genders in there, make sure I have a representation of different age groups. Think of who you're targeting in your study population. Maybe you're only interested in younger people, in which case you only have to interview younger people. But within that, try and get some variety to better represent kind of the wider young population, right? Or if it's all adults that you're interested in, then the wider adult population in Canada. It's not perfect. It never will be. That's what I'm saying. But the more steps you take, the more you can do, given the time and resources you have, the better quality your sample will be. And hopefully the more varied your responses will be, and you'll get better coverage of what would you see across at least a variety of different types of individuals and social groups. So doing that for your qualitative research as much as you can. Obviously, if you're running a survey, it becomes even more important because we value representativity more in quantitative methods. And so, you know, doing your best, maybe that's through quota sampling, maybe that's through purchasing a better quality sample from a polling company, which is often what many researchers do in Canada, versus just surveying their friends and people in their networks. So kind of taking the steps that you can. And the more money you have, like in my case, I have grant money, usually the better quality sample you can get. And so we'll make sure that on a number of variables, the sample is representative of what you find across a wider population. Okay, just checking. Yeah, so that's kind of what I had to say about representativity. Okay, so let me now kind of smoothly transition then from the concept of representativity to the concept of saturation, which is one that we saw more in the discussion post this week. So a discussion post, great discussion as usual. If you're interested, please go and read through that discussion board. Lots of really interesting ideas about sampling, especially sampling in qualitative methods, because many of you are going to be using qualitative methods for your own studies. So really worth to go through and have a read to see what different approaches you guys are all adopting and different thoughts about kind of what's important, what you want to emphasize when you're sampling. And one of the ideas that came up in a number of posts in week 5 was the idea of saturation, right? Key concept used in sampling for qualitative methods, right? The idea, the goal of what you're aiming for when sampling, when you're doing, say, interviews or any other type of qualitative method, is to kind of keep going until your results get saturated, more or less. Your findings are saturated. So, you know, if you start interviewing one person and then you do 2, 3, and maybe by your 50th interview, you're not really finding anything new. You're finding the same kind of information and results from your interviews that you were getting in previous interviews. Well, then you've kind of reached saturation officially, right? It's a big concept that qualitative researchers love to use, right? They really like, oh yeah, we sampled until we reached the saturation point. That's great. I don't want to diss that concept. It is an interesting one. It's important to have a kind of goal in mind when you're sampling. However, there are limitations to saturation as well. There's limitations to everything, right? As you're starting to discover in this course, which is okay. It's just so you're aware of them and can account for that when you interpret your findings and when you initially plan your research design at the start of your project. So, saturation. I mean, yes, I'm a quantitative expert, so I'm a little more critical of saturation than, say, most of my qualitative colleagues. Obviously, saturation is used widely amongst qualitative researchers. You see it in peer-reviewed journal articles, in recent articles, so definitely use it as a concept. I'm not saying don't use it. Like I mentioned, it does have its advantages. But keep in mind, it has its limitations. Because in reality, you never know if your findings are actually saturated or not, right? You might, you're at interview number 50, You do interview number 51, nothing new. Interview 52, nothing new. 53, 54, 55, all the way, say, like, you keep going for another 10 or 12 interviews just to be sure that you didn't have anything new that's coming up in terms of information from your research participants. And you're like, okay, it's saturated, I've reached my saturation point, good to go to move now into data analysis and writing up my findings. Yes, but also be aware that maybe if you had kept going by interview 75, you would have found something different, but you never know, right? And so there is, like, obviously keep going a little bit after saturation to see if it was just like a few cases that didn't give you any new information, then you do start finding new information again. At some point you have to stop. But be aware that maybe any time you'd stopped, maybe in the future you have found something new. I actually find it quite funny. I would actually want researchers to just be more pragmatic and honest, be like, listen, I ran out of time and money, right? Like, I got to interview 50, didn't find anything new for another 10 or 12 interviews, so I stopped. And that's okay, because I didn't have the time to go and do another 50 interviews, or I didn't have the resources to go and do another 50 interviews. That's fine. It's okay to be pragmatic that way. I'd rather we were. It goes for quantitative sampling too. It's like, listen, I didn't have the money to get 3,000 people, so I only got 2,000 people, because it costs money to get a certain number of people from polling firms when you sample for surveys. And so, this is what I could do with the time and money I had. And so I feel I'd rather, as researchers, we say that rather than like, oh, I reached saturation. It's like, but how do you actually know you reached saturation? Yes, you reached a point of saturation, and you also ran out of time and money. And that's cool, that's fine. I'd rather we just be honest about that, because that's the practical realities of doing research. When, we're human, other people are human, you can only do so much, right? So keep that in mind. The other limitation with saturation is tied to more surrounding qualitative methods, is also a phenomenon, what we call in the social sciences, homophily. Homophily is the phenomenon that people around us look and act like us often, not always, but as a trend, right? I'm more likely to have friends and family members who are of a similar social class, racial background, set a political stance than myself. Not always, but usually, right? I was socialized within that group, and I have also sought out friends who share similar values to myself. And so often people look more like me than not in my social network. That's the case for all social networks in any society, including yours and everyone else's. What that means is that when researchers do a convenience sample for their own qualitative studies, they're often getting people who are interested by the topic and who are university educated, and usually of an upper social, kind of upper middle to upper social class, maybe of a similar racial background as themselves. So that's something to keep in mind, right? It's not just you, that's many studies are like that. I mean, it is something we do criticize qualitative methods for, is that those convenience samples, those snowball samples, and many of you mentioned this in your discussion post, they typically have certain individuals more than others, especially white university educated women seem to be a lot more willing to take part in studies, especially qualitative studies, than say men without a university education or of a racial minority background. Not always, but as a trend. And so that's something you have to keep in mind. Maybe you reached a certain saturation point in your findings when you did your 40, 50 interviews. However, maybe that saturation point is just for that kind of group of people that are kind of similar to you, or university educated, etc. And maybe if you'd managed to get different types of individuals outside of academia more, people maybe who are less interested by the topic but are still willing to give you a bit of time, maybe you have found something completely different amongst those other groups. So, as much as you can, diversify your sample, of course, but keep in mind, even with all your efforts, you're probably going to get a certain type of individual in your sample, especially for qualitative methods. We also struggle with it in quantitative methods as well, but we have techniques and we kind of work on it more to try and break out of that bubble. Some qualitative researchers do as well, some don't. And so be aware of that your saturation point might actually only be for certain types of individuals. And if you'd had gotten outside to other areas of the population, maybe you would find something else, right? So again, you can only do so much in the time and with the resources you have. So it's more about being aware of all of these limitations, right? And that there is no perfect solution. Work as much as you can to improve the quality of your sample, given all that I've discussed and all that you guys covered in the course material this week and in the past. But also be willing to think through, okay, what are some of my sampling biases, right? Because all samples have them. Sample bias is how, in some ways, your sample isn't representative of the wider population, right? Another concept we saw this week. And so what are the potential sample biases that I have? Do I have people who are all super interested in the theme that I'm studying? And so they actually have specific views on it that someone who might be more indifferent doesn't, or has different behaviors, for example? Are there certain social groups that are more prevalent in my sample than others? And how might that impact my findings, right? Identify potential sample biases that you have. The issue with sample biases is sometimes we don't know because we don't have population information. We don't know how much of the population is interested by your topic of research, usually. And so we can't really compare. But most likely, there's probably some bias there, right? People are more likely to give their time on something that interests them versus the ones who aren't interested by it. And so keep that in mind. Think through the possible biases that could be there. That's like kind of almost theorizing an element of your methods. And then think about how that might have impacted the results that you did get, right? So that you understand, okay, the results are, hang on, car. Okay, we're good. And so think through what kind of impact does that sample bias have on the findings I got? Are my findings specifics to certain types of individuals? And how might that kind of impact the theory that I'm building and the main kind of findings that I'm presenting? And it's okay, right? Like I said, all studies have this. My studies have that. Everyone's studies have that. The sign of a good quality research is that you're aware of that and you're able to discuss and talk through these limitations so that the reader, your reader who's consuming your findings, is also aware of its strengths and limitations. And again, it can be an avenue for future research. It's like, hey, listen, I didn't have that many people without university education in my sample this time around for the kind of practical limitations I had. But in future studies, we could expand to different populations and see if we get similar findings or not. And here's what maybe we could expect for these other populations based on theory, right? So that's the sign of good quality research, right? So if you're reading an article and someone's like, I got the best sample, it's the perfect sample, it's totally random or it's totally informative, I reached total saturation, it's great, there's no limitations. That's poor quality research. Be wary of that and be very critical. There's always limitations, right? So be aware of that, think through them, and think about the potential impact on your findings, and be transparent and honest about it when you write up those findings, right? That's good quality research. Okay, so like I said before, I could go on forever about various aspects of sampling. It's something that really fascinates me, but I'll stop there. I mean, we covered some important topics on representativity, saturation, and sampling bias. And, you know, again, that was in this feedback video. In the discussion board, there's even more. In your mini lecture videos, there's even more. I'll post my top 3 mini lectures, as usual, sometime this coming week when I manage to grade everything. And but I did want to take a few minutes now before we go just to touch base on what's coming up for the next few weeks, because the next few weeks are now starting to look a little bit different in a good way, because reading week is kind of in there. So I want to make sure everyone's clear on what's happening, right? So this video, the week 5 feedback video, will post at the beginning of week 6, right? And so your week 6 mini lectures and discussion posts on qualitative data collection, that's the theme for week 6, they're due as usual by the end of day on Friday, the 11th of October. So that's the Friday just before the long weekend. and it's Friday is not a holiday, so I'm allowed to get you guys to submit stuff on the 11th. I do check these things, so apologies, but you can always submit it earlier if you want to take the full Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday long weekend. And then after that is reading week, right? So the 14th to the 18th of October, so that week in which Thanksgiving falls, is reading week. So there are no mini lectures or discussion posts due during reading week. I'm not asking for anything on reading week. Obviously, if you guys got time, you can catch up on other stuff in this course or other courses, but nothing due. Take the reading week to kind of catch up or to pursue things that you want to, or, you know, if you have a desperate need for a break, take a break. A good break often leads to more productive work afterwards. By the way, life-work balance there. And then after that, the week after reading week is week 7. And so that's another week on qualitative data collection. So there'll be mini lectures and discussion posts due at the end of week 7 as usual on Friday the 25th of October. But also due at the end of week 7 on the 25th of October, that Friday, is that critical analysis of a scientific article. That's that one-off course requirement that I'm getting you guys to do this term. More information about that course requirement in Learn, under Learn Content Course Requirements. I've got a video with all the instructions for the critical analysis of a scientific article. I give you guys 4 articles. You pick one to do basically a critical analysis of the methods used in that article. So go and watch the instruction video for more detail on that one. And yeah, so if you find that the mini lectures and the discussion posts too much, and you've still got freebies on the mini lectures and discussion post front, obviously you can use one of your freebies that week so that you have less work and just kind of focus more of your time in this course on the critical analysis. Or if you want to do all of it and want to start a bit early, some of it in reading week, that works too. Whatever, you know, suits you best, just kind of be aware of the options that are available to you. But I do want that critical analysis submitted by the 25th of October. I do accept late submissions, but you do lose late points and those accumulate very quickly. So make sure you do submit it on time. And hopefully it's a fun kind of activity and application of what you've been learning so far in a kind of different context, in the context of someone else's research and an existing high quality peer-reviewed article that you pick out of the 4 that I give you. So yeah, so that's what's coming up. In terms of my office hours now, those also kind of shift around a bit because I'm not in Waterloo, so I can't have them in person. I am here now in the Gatineaus, but I can still have them virtually in week 6. So I'll have my regular week 6 office hours, so this present week that this video is posted. Usual Tuesday, 3 to 4 p.m., Friday, 11 till 12, but they'll be on Zoom only, so just go and join the Zoom room. I'll be there, can answer any of your questions. Great time to ask questions about the critical analysis of a scientific article, because the following week in reading week I don't have office hours. I've tried in the past, no one bothers coming in reading week, so I'm not going to bother with office hours then in reading week. And my office hours on Tuesday the 22nd of October on that week 7 are also cancelled. Again, got something else I have to be doing and I can't make my office hours. It seems to be a lot this term, I apologize, but you guys seem to be doing okay and didn't need a whole lot of office hours so far, so hopefully that continues. But I do again restart my regular hybrid in-person and virtual office hours on Friday the 25th of October. So if you have a last minute questions about the critical analysis, you can ask them then on the 25th. But before that, come see me this week in week 6 during my virtual Zoom office hours to kind of help you plan out that course requirement, because it does take a certain amount of time to complete properly and provide a good quality analysis of the methods of that article that you pick out of 4 available to you. Okay, so that's coming weeks. As always, just shoot me an email if you have any questions about this. I've put up a post on Learn on the homepage announcements about all of these changes as well. And, you know, I'll do my best to answer what you ask me over email. If it's a big kind of discussion piece that we have to cover together, I'll tell you to come see me during office hours as much as possible. But yeah, I am around, so please do use me. I'm a resource to help you with this course, of course. And yeah, I think that's about it. And so I will wish you all a happy long weekend, Thanksgiving, if you celebrate it. And I will see you all back in the game on week 7 when we restart the course after week 6. After reading week, we restart on week 7. All right, see you in the next video. Bye. Okay, so for a post-credit scene, no super exciting wildlife in sight. Sometimes there's black bears around here, but didn't see any today. But on this walk, what I thought would be fun to show you guys is there's this kind of old wooden covered bridge on Meech Valley Road. Originates, I believe, back from the 19th century. They've had to rebuild it a few times because it's burnt down a few times. And so I thought we'd go and see if we could survive walking through it, because it is a bit dodgy, even though it's a very nice covered bridge. It's still a wooden one. They still allow cars through here, which is a bit ridiculous, because I've seen the blob underneath this bridge. It's not super confidence building. But I'm just walking through, so this is it. So here we go, surviving the creepy creepy covered bridge from, I don't know when they built this. I think they rebuilt it sometime in the 80s. Back in the day. I mean, this is still a small road, but there's more traffic on it than it used to be. And we made it through. Okay, survived. All right. I will see you guys in the next video. Bye.